Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Power 365 show. Today we have Greg Hurlman on the show and talking about everything PCF. So PCF, the PowerApps Component Framework. So exciting times. He's a developer at Microsoft on the PowerApps Component Framework. We're going to discuss guidelines, best practices, technical consideration of using PCF within PowerApps. Full show notes for this episode can be found at nz365guy.com/188. Now let's get on with the show. Hey, Greg, welcome to the show.
Hey, very good to be here.
So it's good to have you on and get a chance to unpack the PowerApps Component Framework today. But before we go there, Greg, can you tell me a bit about, what part of the world you hail from? And what do you do when you're not working?
Sure. I am, like a lot of folks that work for Microsoft, in the Seattle area. I actually live in Seattle itself. And I quite enjoy it out here. I came out here for work. And when I joined the Dynamics 365 organization as an engineer, and it's actually been really nice. We're finally getting into spring. We're getting sun more often than not. And yeah.
Makes sense.
Seattle is rainy all the time. Never come here.
I've been there a few times. So where did you come from before you moved to Seattle?
I would say I always tell people the East Coast of the U.S., mostly because I was originally born in New York City. I grew up in New Jersey, up and down the East Coast. But mainly I've been in New York, Washington, D.C., and then Seattle. So apparently I only like to live where it's too expensive to live.
So we're in crazy times at the moment. COVID is top of mind for a lot of people working from home. What's your key working from home strategy at the moment?
For me, what helps is that we have my kind of computer desk set up in our second guest bedroom that we use for whenever anybody's staying over. So with nobody else staying over right now, being how things are, it is very much like going into the office, only my commute is about 10 seconds long, if even that long, versus around about an hour. So I go into the kitchen, I make my coffee, I get my breakfast, whatever. I come into the office, I sit down, and I get to work. And when I wrap up, I lock the computer, get up and walk into the other room, and then I'm, quote, home. It actually works pretty well. It's enough of a separation just having this other room.
So how do you, I like that you have that separation. How do you deal with, if you like, not having the variety of face-to-face connections that potentially you would have? And what do you do for play, as in in this scenario, to kind of switch off from work and really, have some downtime?
Sure. Myself and a couple of other groups of friends do have kind of standing virtual happy hours where we'll all just kind of get together in some kind of video chat and talk about whatever's going on, just kind of hang out. When I'm kind of switching off altogether, I mostly stick to playing a lot of video games more than anything else. And these days, it's mostly Animal Crossing, as it is for a lot of folks. It's the least stressful video game on the market, and honestly, that's what we all need right now.
Yeah, so true. Okay, interesting. So what led you to end up working for Microsoft?
So it's actually a strange story. Right out of college back in 2000, I got a job at Microsoft working for support. If your classic ASP application was hanging or crashing on the server, you probably would have gotten me on the phone.
Gotcha.
I did that for a couple of years and then moved on. In those couple of years, .NET came out, ASP.NET came out, and I moved on from being a web service support guy to being more of a .NET developer. And I moved on from Microsoft to work for all sorts of people, both as a contractor and as a consultant for all the various partner companies that are out there for a little over a decade. And during that time, SharePoint really kind of became kind of one of the bigger platforms in like 2007 or so. So I became a SharePoint developer using .NET. Did that for a long time. A lot of my projects there were with the focus of creating something so that users didn't have to call IT to get something done on their site. They could do it themselves. They could change their own CMS, yada yada. And that's really carried through to when I rejoined Microsoft. I rejoined as part of the Dynamics 365 organization, and I bounced around in there from Dynamics portals, now PowerApps portals, to the Dynamics 365 app for Outlook, and then now landed on the PowerApps Component Framework team. And here, it's actually been kind of a crossing of the two things that I've really focused my whole career on. One, software development. As a professional developer, as a web developer, I'm constantly creating applications, visualizations, whatever it was for our users. And then on top of PowerApps, PowerApps is built for your app makers, for folks that are there in the business to really develop solutions for themselves. And the framework is really that overlap between the two, where professional developers can create custom controls using everything they have at their disposal, JavaScript to HTML, CSS, yada, 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 and then deploy it to the environment where app makers just use it. And that control feels and looks like any other control. And it gives that kind of like good dovetailing of professional developer and citizen developer towards an end product that hopefully is something that users are just going to use and make their work lives a little better.
Yeah, I like it. So just unpack it a little bit for me, the journey of PCF actually in the core product. In other words, where Microsoft are using, and have been on this journey for a while of using PCF for a lot of the interface components are there, and then of course moved into this area where other developers can create their own PCF controls. What's your thinking then around that whole core platform and internal use of PCF?
You're absolutely right. PCF has actually been gotten feeling a little more mature than it would seem to be. It's only really even been available for the public to take a look at since last fall. But there's a lot there, and that's because the Dynamics 365 unified client interface, a lot of those controls are built on an earlier internal version of the PowerApps Component Framework. It was decided to take the framework that we had written just for our own product and extract it and allow third parties to start building controls based on that same API. And that's what we've done. And what we're working on now is against a strict kind of adherence to first party and third party being the same experience. So we have internal teams at Microsoft working on the next experiences for Dynamics and for PowerApps, building controls using the same tooling, the same framework as third parties are using to build controls. So the same pain that you might be experiencing as a framework developer for whatever reason, the same tooling that you're using, internal teams are using that same tooling, are experiencing that same pain, and it allows us to iterate much more quickly as we're experiencing the exact same issues ourselves building a product as you would be building things on top of the product.
Yeah, makes sense. If you thought of it from an end game perspective, where would you like, if we crystal ball the future, to be with PCF for internal use, and therefore also, what would be GA'd for the public? As it is right now, the API surface that we have for third parties is not exactly the same as it is for first parties. Mostly because we had been adding APIs for really whatever we needed as an internal organization just to get our product ready. But a lot of it was very dynamic specific because that's where it came up. And we were focused on having our third party available APIs really be at parity between canvas-based Power Apps and model-driven apps, which is really kind of that Dynamics UCI interface. Yeah.
So further on down the line, as we get on towards GA later this year, we're looking at making sure that anything you can do on the model-based side, you can do on the canvas side, and trying to round out the edges around how easy it is to create a component, making sure things like data sets are there. I think that's been released most recently. We're looking towards seeing what it would look like to try to get PCF onto things like a PowerApps portal. That work hasn't started. That's just something we're talking about because we've heard so much feedback.
Yeah.
And I think towards the future, it would really be third parties and first parties using the exact same tooling with the same APIs, to where there wouldn't be any difference between what we're doing and what third parties are doing. Much like after extracting out the CDS from Dynamics as well, Dynamics, as it is right now, is a highly customized CDS app, model-driven Power App with a whole lot of extra stuff built on top of it. But much like how we always describe SharePoint as a super complicated ASP.NET website. There's nothing there that you couldn't build if you put in the amount of time and developers that we have with the tools that we give you, and that's really the goal. And when it comes to code components versus Canvas components, or just you might see in the docs, it's just components. We're trying to make it so that users, app makers, when it comes time to actually build their app, they go into one interface to pick out components, and then code components and Canvas components are there just as a way to give folks a way to separate what might not be there. Like maybe on the code side, there's a little more admin knobs and sliders around what it'll be available and what won't be available. But aside from that, we want it to look and feel to an app maker like it is the exact same thing on either side. They're just picking something from a library and using it.
Do you think there'll ever be a point where the surface that we work on, as in the user interface surface, including the left navigation, the upper navigation, will all be ultimately anybody could build controls to even replace or use as an alternate to the ones that Microsoft provide? So I'm talking about the areas that kind of sit currently within things like sitemap.
Yeah. I think eventually there will be options for that. Now, it may not be directly in like your model-based app configuration where you're swapping out the nav control for something else. It'll be more like as we move towards a convergence of model-based Power Apps and Canvas-based Power Apps to where you're just building an app. And you might have model pages and you might have Canvas pages. What that converged app might look like, I can imagine seeing where your nav, your top bar, your sidebar, or really however you wanted to manage that could be custom as you would be used to in a Canvas style, but then also include model-based pages inside that custom app. That convergence of being just kind of one Power Apps being one thing and not having to choose if you want model-based or Canvas is something that we're starting to work on. That can be a while down the road. But this convergence, the one control and PCF to run inside model-based or Canvas-based with one set of code and one deployment is kind of like that first baby step in that direction.
What are the kind of the big or the highlights like around lessons learned so far on this journey, and what's kind of influenced your decision processes for PCF specifically?
We're definitely looking at we have all our telemetry that we gather as being a cloud service, and we're slicing and dicing those numbers, looking at how happy people are creating apps that take advantage of PCF controls versus maybe apps that are just running out of the box. We're looking at how many controls are being deployed out there. We don't really see what they are or what they're doing, just how many. And making sure those numbers are in the right direction. If they start falling off a cliff, we'll know we'll have some work to do. But on the developer side, like creating a PCF control, how that feels with the tooling and the debugging and all that, we don't have a lot of insight into that quite yet. So that's been mostly the work of our community folks, our program managers, and even myself, as far where I can find folks, as far as just to talk in person or on Twitter or wherever else people are around how things are, where the pain points are. and everything else.
Yeah.
And that's definitely, it seems like in the last 3 months or so, we must have hit some sort of a pivot point where
Okay.
on the like the PowerApps forums, if somebody asks a question about PCF for those first few months, it would be somebody from the product team that would have to jump in and answer those questions. And it seems like in the last couple months, we've hit a point where the community can start answering those questions for the new folks coming in. And to me, that's a good sign that the community's out there. They seem to be as engaged as professional developers in PCF as we're seeing in our app makers being engaged with the PowerApps community, working on out-of-the-box Power Apps. So that fervor for Power Apps seems to be continuing across that divide, which to me is fantastic.
Yeah. It's interesting because, for, I suppose, 18 months or so, there's been this massive comms patterns coming out of Microsoft around the citizen developer, and really, hey, you don't need pro devs anymore. Anybody can build anything. And I suppose there was, to a degree, an alienation of pro devs, going, that would cut code, that would build software. And was there a future with them in the Power Platform and the Dynamics 365 landscape? And of course, what PCF really clearly shows is there's massive opportunity for pro devs to continue on and build out components.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that some of that messaging was probably coming through at the big Microsoft conferences where developers are used to a lot of the focus being on them particularly.
Yeah.
And I don't think it was really against developers so much as they felt left out of the conversation. I've talked to a lot of developers in the meantime, really since last year at Build or so. Is really seemed like Power Apps kind of came out and hit that kind of point where everybody sort of started noticing. And what I've been telling developers, whether you're a developer as a part of a partner kind of consultancy, if you're a developer at a big organization that has its own IT and developers that are there, I would say that the reason that your users are really looking at Power Apps is less because they don't want to deal with you, but more because of two things that are just kind of a fact of big enterprise IT life, is that a lot of times if you talk to IT, you want to have a project, it doesn't have to be that big. You might hear back from IT that sure, they can get to you, but it's going to be 6 months. It's going to be however long, because they've already got this long runway of projects that are running from other parts of the company that have a lot of money. And then once they get to it, there is that money contingency where, depending on a lot of companies, are set up with cross charging, where if you're going to have IT build something for you, you have to pay for it out of your budget. And if you were looking at a Power App that's maybe going to help you and the other 10 people in just your sub team, there's not going to be an approval for an IT project for them. So that's where you've gotten a lot of things in previous lives that have where you have your Excel spreadsheet that is kind of really driving that little part of the business. Or you might have had something in Access, or you might have had something in many of the other things of the past that we've had. And what I've said is that IT is not going to run out of work. Developers are not going to be run out of jobs. There's going to be plenty of work there for a long time. And now with Power Apps, there is that opportunity there, both with the PowerApps Component Framework to build custom UI for these apps, but also inside the other side of custom connectors to get your legacy APIs into the Power Platform. One of the folks that I've talked to talked about a legacy application they've had in their company for the last 15 years. It's based on ASP.NET, but it's gotten, it's grown and grown and grown all that time, and a lot of users don't like to use it, especially if they're on their laptop and they're out in the field somewhere and their connectivity is not super great. But they've taken the back-end APIs, or they've even written web APIs to live on top of the same SQL databases that are sitting on the back end, and written custom connectors for those APIs. So now they have little applets inside Power Apps that can address just small parts of that of that application, where maybe somebody had a particular form in that app they were filling out all day. Now that can be a Power App, and it just sends it to the same SQL database in the back end. So the big app and the big reporting and everything else that goes on can still run based on that data. So you give your users better, upgraded, kind of purpose-built little small apps that really address their particular issue, and everything that your legacy stuff has been kind of relying on for the last 15 years, that can't go away without a giant project, can still sit there and run and do its thing. So there's a lot of flexibility there, and it's just a matter of really finding the opportunity for the Power Platform. And a lot of that is having the empathy for your users to really understand what their pain is. And a lot of IT folks are too separated from that. Not that that's their own fault. It's just how companies are set up. And it helps the companies that we've seen somebody who is put in charge of listening to those users and maybe going back to IT and spinning up maybe a mini PowerApps group inside IT. We've seen tremendous outpouring of folks creating tons of different apps. And that's all using out-of-the-box stuff, maybe with little bits and pieces, custom controls that were put out there for a particular thing that people were used to seeing in their apps, or a custom connector that was going back out to the master data APIs that they use in every application everywhere. So the whole company is running on the same set of countries in the world, or the same, whatever it is. So those are I could go on and on with what the opportunity is. The point is that there's plenty of opportunity, and there's no reason to be afraid. And we've definitely gotten the feedback that people felt ignored, and we're doing what we can to address it now. Yeah,
it's good. It's good. Now, Greg, forgive me. I'm not a developer.
Sure.
But what I'm going to ask here is, tell me about if devs are listening to this podcast and they've not got their hands on the PowerApps Component Framework yet, what are the steps they need to take? So we're just talking to a pro dev audience here. What steps do they need to take? And then I'm going to ask you secondary from the citizen dev side, what steps would they need to take to start engaging with the controls? So taking that pro dev view right now, what are the steps? How do they, start to build controls? How do they access the framework and start producing components up to a solution state?
Sure. Okay. So the first things that a pro developer is going to need to do is install the tools that we rely on to build everything. The PowerApps Component Framework is a TypeScript, JavaScript-based framework. And as such, we use Node and NPM to actually run and build our controls. So you need to have Node.js installed and NPM that comes with it on your computer. And the other thing that you need is the MS build tools when the time comes to actually package up your component to deploy it. So that means either having some version of Visual Studio installed. It doesn't have to be professional. It could be the community edition, or at the very least the MS build tools, so that you have it on the command line. And then just be comfortable with using the command line to do everything, because the scaffolding, the creating of a project, building your project, packaging it, is all done on the command line right now. We do have a Visual Studio extension that the tooling team has been working on, but they're working on that alongside a number of other things, and it's just a matter of finding the time to get everything done. So right now everything is on the command line, so be okay with that. But if you have NPM and you have MS Build ready to go, you can go out to the documentation site on docs.microsoft.com or aka.ms/PCFdocs. And we've got tutorials there. We've got a number of sample components there. And we've actually got those sample components. If you go on the documentation and can click on the link, it'll actually bring you out to GitHub. All those sample components are part of our PowerApps samples repository out on GitHub. So you can pull all that code down and look at the samples we've written, how they work, and build everything from there.
Brilliant. Now, for the app maker or the citizen dev, what's their experience? Because they're obviously not be doing the coding side and getting things up to solution ready. From that solution point forward, what's their kind of pathway to, one, I suppose, find out what is available or what's possible out there, and in some cases they might even have to engage a pro dev to build something they need. Kind of, what would you recommend to them?
What I would say, as far as seeing what's out there already, inside the PowerApps authoring portal, where you're actually creating an app, you click on the import, the custom menu at the top. Click on import component, and it'll pop in a panel from the side, and the panel will default to the canvas-based out-of-the-box components. But there's a second tab up there that says code. If you click on that, it'll query the back-end environment for any code components, PCF components that have been deployed, and show them there. You just choose one, click import. That'll import the definition of the component to your app. And then you just click on the plus menu in the left nav to add a control. There'll be a new item there in the tree called code components. Open that item up, and the component you just imported should be there. You click on it, and it'll just add it to your app like any other control, and you can just work with it from there. If you have an idea for a control or a need for a control, and you need yourself a developer to maybe put it together, what I would say is understand what it is that you need out of that control, what it is that the out-of-the-box product isn't giving you, and most importantly, understand what data that you're trying to show inside that control. Is it rows and columns? Is it a bunch of data that you would normally show in a gallery, but the gallery is being limiting for whatever reason? And is it read only? You want to grab data from somewhere and show it? Or is it read and write? You want to get data, change it up, maybe create a new version of whatever it is and save it back. And then it's just a matter of working with your development group to get down what it is you want it to look like, how configurable it should be. Can you actually get the data from one of our out-of-the-box connectors, and you just want to show it differently? That's certainly an option as well. One of the recommendations I give to our folks using PCF is to not necessarily do all your data calls inside your component. Try to make it as thin just a UI layer if possible, and expose properties for your app makers to fill in to pass the data that you need into your component. That allows your app makers to kind of play with your component, maybe in ways that you weren't planning on. Maybe you build a component for a particular application you're building, but now that component is just there, and in follow-up applications, they might use it in a completely different way with completely different data that might still fit, and you just haven't planned on it because you're just not as close to the business as your users are. So I try to have that kind of conversation with folks. But really, if you're an app maker and you're thinking that this could be your first step into professional development, we do encourage that. But definitely, as what folks have found, is if this is your first step into professional development, there's a whole lot there. This is one of in the PowerApps group, we talk about no cliffs in learning PowerApps. This is definitely one of the biggest cliffs that's there right now, because it's not just learning PowerApps, but it's learning modern web development on top of that. And that by itself is a whole hill of beans, so to speak.
Yeah. So are there any plans to address that, as in from Microsoft's view of things?
There are. It's definitely something that we talk about. And it's just a matter of trying to figure out how much we want to teach ourselves versus pointing to, Microsoft as a whole, for whether it's our web technologies groups or other parts of our developer division, are trying to lead web developers in general and help new web developers grow. So we want to build on top of the work those groups are already doing, and then just try to spin it in particular to PowerApps, and just trying to figure out what that might look like and how we can lead people through that without letting them feel like they've been kind of dropped off by the side of the road and told to find themselves home, is actually kind of a challenge. It's hard to, as a developer, to remember how much you've learned for as long as you've been doing web development, just because so much has changed just in the last 3 years, but it builds on top of stuff that's been around for 20 years. So there's a lot there.
So one of the tools I always look to for ideas around PCF controls is a website called pcf.gallery, which is, I don't know, there's a heap of resources on that site put together by Guido, one of the MVPs in the community that from day one got heavily involved in this space. For you, do you see any kind of, that might pop into your mind here, standout examples in the wider community or even in customers where they have built controls that, made you go, wow, that's pretty cool. And, because obviously you're creating a tool set that allows people to go out and create pretty much anything, within that interface that they want. Anything kind of jump to mind for you?
There's a couple that jump to mind. There was one there. You've seen a few different versions, both from the product team and also out in the community of map controls being built. That was really kind of one of the big first initial things. But we've seen some out there that have really taken that map control and brought it to that next level, where they weren't just dropping pinpoints on the control. You could select the pinpoint, see information about, I think it was accounts on a map, but inside that account, it was you could then open that up to a different panel to dig into that account, find out what you needed, and it dug in deeper and more smoothly. It looked slick. It had all the animation. It was almost like a product in itself inside a control. And that might be what they're actually looking. It may be something they're actually looking to sell once they can get these sorts of things on AppSource. But something else I've seen as well from one of our bigger customers that work with a lot of in the energy space, a lot of oil and things like that they had oil field configuration and mathematics that was going into values that was being shown inside a model-driven app. That inside the app, you would just see this. Before, you would just see this number, and you had to take it on its face that number was correct because somebody else did some math and put it there. And what they did was create a control where the number was there, but you could click a little drop down next to the number and see the mathematical formula and all the different fields that were being pulled in and assigned to variables to actually do that math end to end. And if you wanted to click into each one of those and see where that number came from, it would open that up on another screen, and it would have its own all the way back. So all these formulas were feeding into each other and feeding into each other. But if you had a problem with something, you felt it was in the math, you could then follow that math all the way back to something that was maybe like 12 formulas deep in the overall mathematics and maybe find what the problem was. And this was just through exposing this information inside a control. And that's, it's very specific to their organization. It's very specific to the data they have. That's something that we as a product team would have never built on our own. It's way too specific, but for them, it was a lifesaver, which was actually really neat.
So you raised something interesting there around AppSource, and I've heard a lot of questions come from developers that want to produce PCF controls that could be used as part of a wider, solution for customers. Mm-hmm. And there's currently doesn't seem to be any way that, for example, they could put them up on AppSource or, and some of the restrictions of that is that in AppSource, you need to be a Microsoft partner before you can even list a product up there. Yeah. And these are individual developers that they've not got the intention to, suppose, go down that becoming a partner type. It just doesn't make sense, right? Because they're not really fitting in that framework. What's your thinking at the moment around that, and what are your thoughts potentially going forward for that kind of getting those controls onto AppSource?
Well, when it comes to getting stuff onto AppSource, that's controlled by our ISV team. It is, as you mentioned, very, very geared towards partner companies that have agreements with Microsoft in general to sell their products through that particular channel. And I haven't heard anything about opening that up to individuals anytime soon. But that said, I don't know if I would get those emails anyway. That's a team that we work with an awful lot because they develop our tooling. but we're not in all their meetings, certainly not in all their planning. Now, for an individual developer that maybe wants to sell their components, like there's nothing inside the applications, nothing inside Dynamics, nothing inside PowerApps that's limiting importing solutions that were sourced through AppSource. Indeed, you can get them from just about anywhere, and we do have partner companies that sell things directly. And then the challenge on the person selling it is to how to protect their IP, right? Make sure that users are not taking it and giving away. And there's a number of ways to kind of work around that. But that is the main kind of, I don't want to say roadblock, but the main problem to fix or to address, really.
Yeah. Interesting. I definitely know there's a demand for it and a way for people to protect their IP without everybody building their own licensing engines, to get these out on market. Tell me what's new or on your radar now that you're considering around PCF and its future, I suppose. Maybe not roadmap. I don't expect any timeframes or anything like that, but kind of what's top of mind in your thinking as you go into the next half of this year.
Like I said, we are talking about initial stages of what it would look like to have PCF inside PowerApps portals, which I think would be incredible because right now PCF is locked behind things that you need to log into, or need to authenticate against your Office 365 tenant anyway. Aside from that, we are looking at creating React native apps for our applications and what it would look like for folks that are creating React-based controls to feed into a React native app. Starting to think about that. And thinking about what we call virtual controls as well. Right now, every PCF control is what we call a standard control, where we give you an HTML div element, and you just need to fill in your div with your UI. Where a virtual control actually is based on React, and your component is inserted into the React application tree, same as into the tree for the application itself, same as any other control that's there. And that has benefits for performance mostly, and also around just smoother flow through kind of the React loop, so to speak. So we're looking at that, but the virtual controls and the React native work, I don't want to say they butt up against each other, but they need to be considered with each other, because if the parent application, whether it's PowerApps or anything else, is running as a React native app, that adds a few more wrinkles for developers that are building React components that live inside that app versus something that is just made for the web. And we need to figure out what our React native story is going to be, maybe before we go down kind of that virtual control route, mostly because we want to make sure that third-party components don't accidentally take down the entire application for whatever reason. We want to make sure that those are sandboxed accordingly.
What about best practice? Is there any kind of best practice recommendation you would have for people that are either building or using PCF?
For best practices, I would say it's a lot of the same stuff you would see for best practices for web development in particular. Make sure that you're cleaning after yourself. If you're creating event listeners, and if you're creating long-running network calls, or if you're storing a lot of information inside the browser itself, that is really just for your control. Make sure you're cleaning all that up when your controls get ready to unload, so you don't wind up leaking memory across the application itself. Other guidance is really around what I was mentioning before. Try to separate your data calls from your PCF controls. If necessary, it's perfectly okay to create a custom connector that is purpose built for your PCF control to get it exactly the data that it needs. But then have the custom connector and have that PCF control be available for your makers later to do goodness knows what with. And don't be afraid of your users, I think is really the key. There is so much information now for tenant administrators around PowerApps. With the PowerApps meta connectors, PowerApps for admins comes to mind as an example, that you can, as an IT organization, not have to restrict users creating PowerApps, but and still be aware of everything that's going on. PowerApps is a cloud service. There's nothing that a tenant admin doesn't have access to. It's just a matter of getting it all in a way that an admin can keep control of it. So setting up your environment policies, get ahead of it. One setup that customers I've heard use that works pretty well is every time somebody creates a Power App or creates a flow, for that matter, that user gets an email from IT saying, "Hey, we noticed you created this app called XYZ. Here's a few links to our best practices and maybe an internal wiki site with learnings that they already have as an organization, and let that just be that. Let it be a light touch. And if a couple of weeks later, if they have a published version and it still only has one owner, reach back out and say, we notice you only have one owner. We think you should add one more. Here's how. If you don't have anybody, let us know. We can add ourselves just to make sure that this app can live on once you move out of your role or somebody else takes over or whatever." So you have that feeling of control. And then, if they don't add it later, you can have a flow that runs and just adds like an IT service count as an owner, so that somebody can always get in. You don't have to worry about it if you are aware of it, right? And it's really the tools are there to make yourself aware of it, and it's just a matter of having somebody inside the IT org that is given the task of handling the Power Platform at your company, same as you would handle databases at your company, same as you would handle web servers at your company. There needs to be somebody that can handle this now. If you do have Power Apps, even if it's whether it's through Office 365, that sort of license, or through Power Apps licenses, so you're paying a lot of money. You should handle it right.
Yeah, correct. Just as we go into closing here, what do you see as the big opportunities for folks out there, whether they be customers, partners, or community members with PCF? What are the kind of, if you were in their position and you weren't inside Microsoft, but you knew what you knew from being in there, what would you be going out and doing?
What I haven't seen yet, and I think it's mostly because it is very new, that we aren't quite into general availability for Canvas apps yet, is that you haven't seen the ecosystem of companies that sell control packs, that sell purpose-built components that are part of a solution that can talk to each other. So that opportunity is still wide open. If you have components that don't necessarily have to look and work the same, but are aware of each other and can flow with each other well, that's something that I would say is out there. Think beyond just a single control. Start thinking about two different controls. What about two different controls that talk to a back end that maybe allows different users to start working together? Start thinking of kind of that next step, like you had mentioned earlier, that a lot of that basic replacing a text box with something else that shows that text in a fancier way, like that's already out there. It was kind of the low hanging fruit. Start climbing up to those next branches. There's all that opportunity is still there. And it's a little more work, and it's a little more thinking, and it's a little more understanding the folks that you would eventually want to give, sell these things to. But goodness knows, there's a lot of folks out there that have that sort of thinking on lock. And I think pointing them at this platform, we're going to see a whole lot of really interesting thing come down the pike in the next couple of years.
So true. Greg, is there anything else you want to add before we get on to some quick fire questions?
No, I think what we've seen out there in community is really great. You already mentioned PCF.gallery. It's not just a great URL. It is a fantastic website that our MVPs Guido has put together. A lot of those controls have pointers to blog entries, if not GitHub repositories. So a lot of those are open source. That if you're getting into PCF, that's a great way to get started. And also fairly new, we do have a learning path kind of not official certification, but learning modules that you can take if you go to aka.ms/learnpcf. That is kind of through our learning team, a newly built thing for PCF. If you're starting from scratch and getting into it, that'll step you through actually creating your controls.
I like it. We'll make sure we put those links into the show notes so you can click through easily and grab them. Okay, let's get on to some quick fire questions.
All right.
Okay, here you go. Would you rather never read another book or never watch another movie?
Let's be honest, it's 2020. Never read another book.
What's an important truth do very few people agree with you on?
Oh, that pineapple on pizza is okay. The problem is usually the deli ham that you're also putting on the pizza.
I like it. What's the worst haircut you've ever had?
Oh, gosh. The worst haircut I ever had, honestly, is probably the haircut that I had for most of my adult life. And it was because I was going into the cheapest haircut place I could find and telling them to cut it to this length and be done with it. Thankfully, my partner that I have now, she convinced me to grow my hair out, which caused me to spend a lot more money on haircuts, but it's actually a whole lot better. Starting to get a little feral now. I'm 7 weeks since my last haircut, so
wow,
we'll see what happens next.
Perhaps she'll have to cut it for you, right?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I've been tempted just to let it go and see what happens. It should be interesting.
Nice. What do you believe in despite having no proof of it? That
the New Jersey Devils can actually win a championship.
I like it. What would be your dream job if money was just not an issue?
Oh gosh, my summer job in college was working as a Jungle Cruise skipper at Walt Disney World for minimum wage. It was probably the best job I had. It definitely got me from being the scared kid at the front of the class to somebody who can actually talk to other people and not sweat to death.
Nice.
And that job was actually pretty great. It's down there in the warm sun. You're out there with people all the time. You get to be funny. That would probably be my kind of dream if I had money and didn't really care. One thing I actually talk about with my partner also is creating a bed and breakfast out somewhere, because we both enjoy cooking a whole lot, and having people over to enjoy that cooking. It's just a matter of our apartment is just too small.
Yeah,
right now.
I love it. Final one here. If you could instantly be an expert on any new subject that you're currently not an expert on, what would it be?
Oh, gosh. I had something in my head, and that's why I'm pausing here, because it is now gone completely. I would probably have to say, just as a developer, anything involving like Kubernetes or containers or any of that good stuff. I haven't had to deal with it, and so I haven't. And it's been a few years now, and it's getting awkward. So I feel like that would be the thing. Aside from outside of technology, I've got my eye on bread baking is the next big thing that I haven't really done any of yet. And I need to get into that next.
I like it. Greg, who do you recommend as a guest on the podcast in future? Anyone of your colleagues that specializes in a particular area inside the business applications group?
One person that I would recommend is not by way of org chart, not necessarily as part of the business applications group, but and I haven't talked to her and cleared this with her at all. But Donna Sarkar,
she's been on. She's already been on.
Oh, she's been on already. Okay.
Yeah.
Gosh, I didn't see her in the initial list. I must have missed her. But since joining the PowerApps group, and it's been interesting to see somebody who is like Donna, who is coming new to PowerApps, to the Power Platform, and how sold she's been on it. And it's real. It's not just her doing her job.
Yeah.
But aside from that, Gosh. It might be worth trying to find folks maybe that are part of our controls teams, or folks that are building kind of the next bit of out-of-box components.
Okay, what about anybody in the ISV side of things where PCF touches that ISV story? Is there, because there's been some changes in that area in recent times. Anybody jump to mind there?
There have been there, and it's the tooling folks are kind of revamping and reorganizing. I think maybe the PM there, if you want a deeper look into talking about either PCF and how things can be built, whether you're talking about how bigger ISV opportunities there. Somebody from that team might be a good way to go, especially around talking about how the future of AppSource. That'd be the group for sure.
I like it. Maybe you could flick me an email after the show about who, what, or where. Greg, before we go, it's been great to have you on the show. If people want to follow you online, are you on Twitter, LinkedIn, anything like that? If you're publishing anything these days?
I am on LinkedIn. You can search for me, Greg Hurlman. I am there. I am most often, probably too much, on Twitter. If you go to twitter.com/98codes, that's the number 9, number 8 codes. I am there. Or if you're not much of a social media person, you can go to aka.ms/Greg. That'll get my profile page on the Power Platform community site. You can log in and then send me a message there.
Hey, thanks for listening. Full show notes for this show can be found at nz365guy.com/188. Feel free to reach out and recommend a person from Microsoft that you would like to see on the show or hear from on the show, and we'll see if we can get them on and listen to what they have to say. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and see you next time.